Lesson 6.5 is talking about rhombuses and squares. So a rhombus is a quadrilateral. If I can write today, no. Okay. So a quadrilateral with all four sides congruent. We're going to learn some more facts about them in a little bit. But a square is a quadrilateral that is both a rhombus and a rectangle. So with that being said, that means a square has all the properties of a rhombus, and it's going to have all the properties of a rectangle, which we learned about in section 6.4. So some properties about a rhombus. So the diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular. So if you see over here in the diagram, it's showing that they are perpendicular, meaning there's 4 right angles. That's going to be huge. If the diagonals of a parallelogram are perpendicular, then the parallelogram is a rhombus. So that's just saying the opposite, which is the converse of what we just learned. So if we can somehow say, oh, these diagonals, they form 90-degree angles in the middle, well, then we're going to know that it's a rhombus. And the last one, it says each diagonal of a rhombus bisects a pair of opposite angles. So if you look at angle B, that large angle B, it's split into 2 equal angles, which are congruent to the 2 smaller angles that make up large angle D. And the same goes for angle A and angle C. This chart is pretty handy because it's telling you some properties about rhombi, which is the plural for rhombus, and squares. So a rhombus has all the properties of a parallelogram. All sides are congruent. Diagonals are perpendicular, and diagonals bisect the angles. So a square has all the properties of a parallelogram, all the properties of a rectangle, and all the properties of a square. That's a very quick way to say, in general, it has 4 90-degree angles, its diagonals are congruent, its diagonals bisect each other, its diagonals bisect the opposite angles, it has opposite sides congruent, opposite angles supplementary, all 4 sides are congruent, all 4 angles are equal, and I'm sure I missed out a couple of the properties that we've learned along the way, but that's just a few to give you some ideas. So let's take a look at the first example. It says use rhombus LMNP to find the value of y if the measure of angle 1 is equal to y squared minus 54. So the measure of angle 1, well, that's right here in the middle, and we know that's where the diagonals bisect each other, and we know that the diagonals are 90 degrees, or they form 90-degree angles. So the measure of angle 1 is equal to 90 degrees. So I'm going to do y squared minus 54 equals 90. So I'm going to add 54 to both sides, so we get y squared is equal to 144. No need to factor in this problem because I don't have just a y term. So all I have to do is take the square root of both sides. Now this is where you must be careful, because when we take the square root of 144, we actually get a positive and a negative 12. And you're probably thinking, well, since it has to do with an angle, it has to be the positive 12. But that's actually incorrect, because if you look back at the problem, we are squaring it. So the negative answer is okay in this problem. So we do end up with a positive and negative 12. All right, let's take a look at this next problem because it's also an example. It says use rhombus LMNP to find the measure of angle PNL if the measure of angle MLP is 64. So MLP, that's this angle, that is 64 degrees, and they want us to find PNL. So they want us to find this wee little one here. Well, we know that opposite angles are congruent, So we know that large angle is 64, and I know that each of those smaller angles is equal to half of that. So we know that the measure of angle P and L is half the measure of angle MLP. So the measure of angle MLP is 64. So half of 64 is 32 degrees. So the measure of angle P and L is 32 degrees. Not too bad. All right, so you have 2 your turns to do. So pause the video, take a moment, try those 2 problems. All right, so for that problem, if you were following along, I set the angle equal to 90, solved it. I did take everything to the left side and then said, oh, I don't really need that. I don't need to set it equal to 0 because there's not just an x term. So I moved it back over, divided both sides by 2, took the square root, and we got x is plus or minus 8 for that one. All right, so now if we try B, we know that the measure of angle CDB is equal half the measure of angle ABC. So I'm going to substitute in what I know and solve. So we get 63 degrees is equal to the measure of angle CDB. All right, and now you guys know that anytime they put a shape on a coordinate plane, we are about to have a ton of fun. So it says determine whether parallelogram ABCD is a rhombus, a rectangle, or a square. They gave us all 4 vertices, and we have to list all that apply. So there's a lot going on here that we need to look at. So first thing that I like to do is the slope, especially when they give me the picture, because if the if opposite slopes are the same, we know the opposite sides are the same. And you're probably saying, well, that doesn't help too much. And you're right, it doesn't. But if consecutive sides have opposite reciprocal slopes, then we know it's 90 degrees. And if that's the case, then we could cross off rhombus. So then we would just need to find the lengths of the sides. So either way, we're going to have to use slope and distance formula to find lengths. So that's why this may not be your favorite type of problem. All right, so I'm going to start off with slope. So I'm going to just quickly find them on here. So 1, 2, 3, 4 over 1. So A to B, better put slope up here. A to B has a slope of rise of 4, run of 1, so 4. All right, I'm going to do the opposite. Oh, no, I'll just go in order. So we'll do B to C. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 over 4 down 1. That's going to be different. B to C is over 4 down 1. So down 1, that's our rise. So that's negative 1 over 4. So BC has negative 1/4. And then C to D, down 4 back 1. So that's a negative, negative. So that's positive. 4 over 1, which is 4. And finally, A to D is left 4, up 1. So left 4 is negative, up 1, left 4. All right. So we can see that opposite sides are parallel. Put that. Opposite sides parallel. And we know that we have reciprocal slopes. So we know that all angles are 90 degrees because slopes are opposite reciprocals. All right, so we know all of that. So now we just have to find the lengths of all the sides. This is the not so fun part. But remember, I should have left that up there. We can use Pythagorean theorem if you prefer that over distance formula. So I'll do that for one of them here. So for a to b, we knew that was 4 over 1. So if this right here is my c value, that's going to be squared. So I'm going to square root 4 squared plus 1 squared. So we get 16 plus 1, so that's the square root of 17. So I'm going to do b to c. Well, that was still for a negative 1. Sorry, I'm moving it a little bit. So we have the square root of 4 squared plus negative 1 squared. So 16 plus 1, that's still the square root of 17. So far, I have 2 consecutive sides being the same length. C to D, well, that again was 4 and 1. So I'm going to have 4 squared plus 1 squared, square root, so square root of 17. And then A to D, remember that was back 4, up 1. So negative 4 squared plus 1 squared, 16 plus 1, square root of 17. So we know that all sides are congruent. So that tells us, so if all sides are congruent, rectangle's out. So it's either a square or a rhombus, because a rhombus also has all sides. But then we look back at the angles, and the angles were all 90 degrees. A rhombus doesn't have 90-degree angles, so the best answer is a square. Okay. If, and they do, they ask us to list all that apply. Since it's a square, if you remember back to the beginning, it says a square has all the properties of a rhombus and a rectangle. So even though square is our best answer, and if we had to list one, we would list square, but since they said list all that apply, a square is also a rhombus and a rectangle. Whoops, forgot my C. So again, if you had to list one answer, it is technically a square. But since a square has all the properties of rhombus or rectangle and it says list all that apply, that's why we have to list all of them. All right, so take a moment, try the your turn. It's the last problem. Might take you a little bit, but take your time. I'm going to go ahead and list all the answers here, like all the slopes, distances, that way you guys can see. All right, so if you see, we ended up getting a square again, but I also like to put that it's a rhombus and a rectangle.